300 years ago, someone was stolen from a village on the West African coast. Nobody wrote down their name, and nobody recorded where they came from. The people who took them made sure of that. And yet, their descendants, on a chain of islands off South Carolina, still carry a clue their captors could never erase. Not a document, not a ship's log, their DNA. And it still points back across the ocean, toward the stretch of coast that village came from. A homeland written into the body itself, one the record spent centuries trying to erase, and never quite could. So how is that even possible? These are the Gullah Geechee. On a thin string of sea islands off South Carolina, Georgia, and northern Florida, they've held their ground for 3 centuries and kept what nearly every other enslaved community in America had stripped from them: their own language, their own food, their own music, and faith. For a long time, historians had a tidy answer. Isolated on remote plantations, the Gullah simply held on to fragments of home. It was respectful, and it was logical. It was also only half the story. Here's what doesn't add up. Across America, slavery worked by design to erase culture. Languages suppressed, families broken apart, names taken, whole bloodlines cut. That wasn't chaos, it was policy. And most isolated communities, in Appalachia or on remote New England islands, lost their old world ties within a generation or two anyway. The Gullah Geechee didn't. What they kept wasn't a handful of scattered fragments. It was whole systems. A working Creole language, a coherent faith with clear African roots, a deep, specific knowledge of land and water. And patterns like that don't come from nowhere. They point back to a source. So the real question was never just how the Gullah held on. Plenty of others held on and still faded. The question was deeper. How did a people torn out of Africa by a system built to erase who they were manage to keep something this specific? Their language? Their rice knowledge? Their memory? Was it the islands? The rice economy? Or would the DNA show that none of this was ever an accident? The first explanation, and still the most common, is simply geography. The sea islands were hard to reach, malaria was everywhere, and planters and overseers kept their distance whenever they could. That distance didn't create freedom, but it created room. Room for a language to grow, for elders to teach, for songs and rituals to pass down. And that's almost certainly part of the truth. But isolation explains how a culture survives, not how it stays this precise. Look closely at Gullah faith, and it isn't a vague African blend. It carries specific Mende, Temne, and Congo threads. The rice knowledge points to one particular ecological zone, and the grammar of the Creole lines up with Sierra Leonean Creole far too neatly to be chance. If the islands were only the container, what was inside them? The second answer leads back across the Atlantic to what historians call the Rice Coast, a compelling explanation, though one scholars still debate. By the early 1700s, planters in Carolina wanted rice from the tidal marshes, but they didn't really understand the crop. Growing it took real expertise, controlling the water, reading the soil, timing everything so one mistake didn't wipe out the harvest. Along the rice-growing coast of West Africa, communities had spent generations building exactly that knowledge. And that is what made them targets. This wasn't an exchange of ideas, it was exploitation. But it backfired. People dragged from a rice region didn't arrive empty-handed. They brought farming systems, language, faith, ways of organizing work. The system wanted bodies, but it needed minds. And by depending on that knowledge, it quietly let that knowledge survive. Before we get to the DNA, one honest caveat. Genetics can't tell the whole story. It can't give back a stolen name or a lost village, and it should never reduce a people to a percentage. A community isn't a pie chart. What it can do is surface patterns the written records buried. When people migrate, are torn apart, or mix, they leave traces, a kind of biological timestamp for movement and ancestry. So researchers didn't ask the DNA to replace history. They asked whether the body still carried what the archives never kept. The expected result was broad, deep West African ancestry, shaped by the violence of the slave trade. And a lot of that held true. But the deeper signal was more careful than the headlines. The genetics didn't hand back a pure origin or a single point on the map. What it gave was a pattern. The most detailed genetic study of the Gullah so far, published in 2021 in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, found they carry deeper West African roots than most African American populations and lean slightly closer to the peoples of Sierra Leone, while at the same time staying clearly related to many West African populations. Earlier work on their maternal lines had already pointed strongly toward African maternal lineages, not one dot on a map, but a pattern. And it leaned the same way everything else did: the rice, the coast, the language, the demand for African rice knowledge. Picture a coastal village in what's now Sierra Leone, around 1720. Your people have farmed this land for generations. You know every plant, every channel of water, every spirit tied to the ground. And then, within months, much of your community is gone. Not scattered at random across an ocean, but carried together to a stretch of South Carolina coast that looks unsettlingly like home. The same tidal creeks, the same marsh, the same low horizon. Your knowledge was why you were taken. And here, it was why you survived, and why you were handed something almost no other enslaved people were: a measure of control. That autonomy is documented. Gullah communities ran the rice operations, directed the work, trained the newcomers, and in doing so, kept their bonds and their memory alive. And that's the reversal that changes everything. The very expertise that marked these people for slavery became the thing that kept their culture alive. Their captors needed their rice knowledge, needed them fluent, needed them to organize and teach. And so every piece of culture doubled as protection. A language became a shelter, a recipe became a map, a basket carried an old pattern, a song held a whole spiritual world when the written record stayed silent. What looked like separation was also cover. What looked like difference was continuity. The culture lasted because it was too valuable to destroy. And the DNA backs what anthropologists long suspected: not a random diaspora clinging to scraps, but a community that held together tightly enough to carry a whole culture across the water and rebuild it. There's a moment researchers describe when they bring the DNA results back to the community's elders. What they meet isn't surprise, it's recognition. Shown a result that points back towards the Sierra Leone coast, people here don't treat it as news. They treat it as confirmation. The science finally catching up to what they'd carried all along, that this is where the rice knowledge came from, and on some level, they'd always known it. After 300 years, the data had arrived at a place the community never really left. Because the DNA was the one record that couldn't be destroyed, passed down through every generation, through every attempt to erase it, carrying a homeland no amount of violence could ever fully wipe away. So what does the DNA really reveal about the Gullah Geechee? Not a pure origin, not one clean bloodline, something layered: West African roots, Rice Coast knowledge, forced migration, coastal isolation, and a language that refused to die. Which means their story was never really about being cut off. It's about the limits of erasure, how knowledge, carried in a language, a faith, the way people work the land or the body itself, can outlast the systems built to crush it. The Gullah Geechee were never just an isolated remnant on forgotten islands. They are, and always were, a living archive.